Welcome back to the Life Recreated Show. I'm super excited about this episode. As you probably may have seen in some of the recent episodes and recent videos, while we were recording this, or actually when we're recording this, it's Women's History Month. And so this is a segment where I've been doing some candid conversations with women that I love, I respect, and that I know personally, and just talking about what their experience has been, what their perspective has been in the church. And so the reason I'm super excited about this episode is because I've gotten on the show interviewing with me none other than the gorgeous, the wonderful, the beautiful, the creative, the spectacular. My wife, Roberta Lee, is here with me on this show this evening. So want to welcome Roberta. Thank you, babe. I'm going to call her babe. I don't know if I can call her babe in the show, but
It's
I
your
think I'm
thing.
gonna do it anyway.
It's your
All
thing,
right,
you
right.
know?
So I think I'm just gonna call it babe throughout the show, but I'm so glad that you're here and having this conversation with me on the show.
Oh, I'm excited to
Yeah,
be here. Thanks
I am
for
too.
letting me in your man cave.
So we're gonna jump into tonight's episode, and this is a candid conversation that I'm gonna be having on a serious note. Actually, it's a candid conversation that I wanted to have with my wife about what her experience was in the church. This is actually how we met. We'll probably talk about that a little bit in the show. She had been in the church for quite a while before I had shown up and before we started talking and getting involved. And I thought it would be great just to really get a perspective of her point of view, because she was able to go through a lot of the different seasons and the different steps of just adulthood and everything like that. And so I think it's going to be really interesting to dive into her experience tonight on the Candid Conversation. And as always, if you're here for the first time checking it out, do me a favor, hit that subscribe button, hit that like button. It'll help us out a lot. So let's jump into these questions if you're ready, Roberta. I always like to start off, especially when I have these conversations, is I like to get your perspective of, or not your perspective, but the story of how you even ended up in the church. What did that look like? What kind of led you to the church? What happened that brought you to the church? Talk to us a little bit about what your initial experiences going into the church was like.
So I was a teenager. I remember the day very clearly. It was a Saturday. I was hanging out with my best friend in her backyard, and these two women walked up to us while we were hanging out. And I remember specifically one of them was who was the pastor's wife at the time.
Okay.
And so they shared the gospel with my friend Shauna and I and let us know that to say this prayer to make heaven our home. And we prayed with them. At the time, I remember my big sister telling me as a teenager, I'm just trying to figure my way out through life. And I remember her mentioning, she was like, maybe find a church or get involved somewhere. Like she was just giving me some pointers. And one of them happened to be maybe going to church or whatever. So I took that to heart and I took their invitation and she came and picked me up that Sunday
Okay.
and I started going.
And did you mention how old you were? Did you say
I
how?
was 15.
Wow. Okay. So you're 15 years old. So as a teenager, I mean, what were you like? You were like a sophomore probably at this time, like
Yeah.
15 around that time.
Yeah.
So you're 15 years old. You're here where we live in Virginia. So you're growing up here in Virginia, and your sister mentions that it would be good to find a church or something like that. And so then you have these ladies approach you right after, and they invite you to church. What did you feel like that was? Did you feel it was like this must be a sign, or
Yeah.
like something
Yeah.
that?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. All right. And then is that what kind of encouraged you to just keep going to the church or something like that, just because how all those connections were making, or did it really mean anything
Yeah.
at the time? Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. It was simple. She said she picked me up for service. And
Okay.
for me, it was just another thing, another good thing to be involved in when it came to the community. When I was in high school, through middle school, high school, I was always taught and told how to just be involved, right? You join SAD club or your class. I was the class reporter for class of 2004.
Glad.
I was always involved in just doing things. And so I just felt like church was another opportunity to be involved in a very positive way with my community.
Okay. Okay. So it's good. I can see that, especially kind of, like you said, being brought up to get involved and for it to be encouraged for you to get in the mix and to be able to put like your talents and your gifts to it. I can see how that can really help. And then even being in the church, I'm sure when you first started going to the church, was there a lot of people there, or what
No,
was this?
no, it was very small.
Okay, how many people would you say it was from?
Probably like 20.
About 20 people. Okay, so this is like baby, baby, baby,
It
baby,
was
baby.
small.
Okay. Okay, so then with 20 people there, what were your thoughts when you first went into the church? What'd you think? How'd you feel when you went in?
I didn't think anything of it.
So you didn't have any
Yeah.
thoughts on like,
It being weird about being small.
yeah, being small or like,
Not for me, it was more personal because, I've been to churches before, with my mom would take us to church, when we're visiting family or your auntie, your grand auntie would I'll go to church with her when I was staying with, hanging out with them for the summer or something like that. I've seen churches where they're just very big and you go to service and then you leave and that was it. So it being small and knowing someone who was willing to pick me up and get me there and, it was just very friendly
okay.
from the
Okay,
beginning.
gotcha.
So,
That's cool. And I guess that's cool because I wonder that sometimes you're like, okay, you go into a smaller atmosphere, a smaller environment, and you're like, whoa, what's going on? There's only a handful of people.
mm,
Like you said, I'm used to it growing up the same way. When we grew up and my parents used to take us to church, it would be several hundred people. So it was just like, oh, okay, this is what church is supposed to look like. So let's just switch gears a little bit. So you're really young at this age, 15, 16 years old. And like I mentioned before, what I really wanted to really dive into and really just kind of get an understanding of was what the role of a woman looked like in the church, and then what kind of it can look like in a spiritually abusive church, or like experiencing that. And that's what we came out of. When you're 15, 16 years old, what were your earliest observations of just women in that church and in their role with it being so small?
childcare.
Childcare. Okay, all right. So
The women
babysitter.
the women took care of they had nursery for Sunday services,
Uh-huh.
Sunday morning and Sunday night, and Wednesday is when they had their services, so women did the childcare. They did Sunday school for the kids, and then they would do the nursery. Also, on the platform, they would either sing or play the keyboard, which typically, in the very beginning, that was typically the instruments. The roles that I saw women doing was
Mm.
singing background and childcare. So I remember, yeah, it was typically singing or playing the keyboard. I do remember there being like a women's outreach anytime anything that was anything that was led by a woman was for women, like either for the women or the children type.
Oh, okay. So that was the only thing, was it was just for women
Yes.
and children.
Mhm.
And then so with your background though, you were so used to being like involved with everything and just trying to jump into the mix. Like you said, you were the involved in school and all these different communities and different clubs and stuff. So when you got there and the only two options you were given was like, okay, either nursery or maybe doing something musical. How did you fit into that? It didn't kind of throw you off, or it didn't like nothing went off in your mind when you didn't see
No, not at the time.
doing anything?
No, not at the time because I was very involved in like with my community with school
So
and
you're already busy.
yeah, school. There was a community center that I used to volunteer and that was kind of my first job experience working in an office space. So I like my world was so large that it didn't dawn on me that there were restrictions there because I
Everything
was
else.
yeah,
Yeah. Okay.
yeah.
Yeah. And then that probably helped to, like you said, you weren't really paying attention to it because you're just busy doing a whole bunch of other things. So I could see how it wouldn't even really be anything that really stuck out. And then knowing your personality, you probably just wanted to help and just be like, okay, what can I do anyway? And it didn't matter
Yeah.
if it was
Yeah.
musical or working with the kids, it really didn't matter. Okay.
Mhm.
Now, did you notice any type of difference? Or you probably, well, I guess you wouldn't really have noticed it earlier on, but did you notice any kind of difference in the treatment of like women and men, like in the church early?
Well, I mean, it was clear. It was clear that they preached the Bible. They were a Bible believing church, and so there was a portion of scripture where they believed intended to mean that women shouldn't preach.
Mhm.
Women should not.
Did you ever feel like you were called to preach?
Mm-mm.
No? Okay. All right.
Why?
I was just curious.
Mhm.
I can see, I mean, you're kind of fiery. I mean, I've been married to you, so I know when you believe in something and you
No,
can be very
I'm
passionate
called to
about it.
teach.
Yeah, absolutely,
you
100%.
know, but teaching and preaching
Can be two different things.
can be two different things and one and the same thing. All the gifts are on the same playing field,
Mhm.
but in that culture, the gift of preaching was up here, and all the rest of the gifts were to support the
Preaching,
preacher
right.
instead
Or
of
the
yeah,
preacher or just preaching in general.
both are all on the same preachers, teachers, musicians, and caretakers. Like they're all gifts that are just as important in the kingdom, and they like to pretend like they believe that, but a lot of times it was like if you're called to preach, you know,
Okay, yeah. Yeah, it's and I can attest to that.
yeah,
That atmosphere gets really quick to get drawn into.
yeah,
It's an atmosphere of
ego,
oh, yeah, 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 it's definitely I think it's definitely an ego thing where you're just and then when you get caught up in it as a man, you're just like, "Oh, man, I'm gonna do whatever it doesn't matter." Like, you don't and it makes sense because a lot of times us as men, we want like a purpose. We want to know that we contributed something at the end of life. When we're done in the world, we want to say, "Hey, I made this difference or I helped." So it does make a difference. But I think going back to your story though, with you being that young and like you said, just being involved in other outlets and being involved in other dynamics in the community, you probably just kind of brush it off because you had so many other ways that you could really fulfill any kind of outlet that you had to help or achieve and do different things like that. So now with that being said, so you're there at 15, so obviously you go through and how long were you we were in the church for what was the total time? 16 and we left
15,
5 years ago?
probably, yeah, 15 years.
About 15 years. Okay. So 15 years. So that means you went through high school.
Mhm.
You went to college. Did any of your observations in how women and men are treated, did any of that observation become clearer as you got older, like out of high school, then into college, like becoming an adult and then noticing it? Because I can see where if you're younger as a teenager, you wouldn't know how to pick up on those cues or even know that there's those differences happening for you as you got older and you got into college and then into adulthood, did you start noticing any of those differences? Did things start to stand out to you on the role differences?
No, because like I said, high school, college, I was doing my own thing. I had outlets to be able to express myself. So
Mhm.
there weren't. And then at the same time, too, in those periods, I was single. There's a different dynamic when it comes to being single. There were a couple of instances. There were a lot of passive aggressive. There were a lot of instances that I could probably say were misogynistic in their nature.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? That stood out to me and things I remember a couple instances specifically that upset me. But again, having other things to do, I don't know if it
Bothered you as
yeah,
much, right? Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, if you
not
already have
until
an outlet.
marriage. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, you what do you mean not until marriage?
Well, because when
Until lockdown? Is that what you're saying?
no, because when we got married, we went into ministry full time, and that's where it felt like not our marriage being a lockdown, but that's when the
Uh-huh.
ministry felt like lockdown. That's when it
Okay.
was like
So it's more of a
watching your every move, like what do you do? Like way too much control, and when I started to continue to take initiatives to do things that I naturally did. I want to do this, I'm going to do this, and all of a sudden it was a problem.
mm.
And that's wait a minute.
Is that where you notice the shift in, okay, now I can see it happening. Like you said, like now whenever we're in ministry now and now it becomes a problem. Is that when the light bulb went on and you were like, hey, what in the
Mhm.
world? Like, how did that make you feel as a woman? I always wonder about that. How does it feel internally to have to deal with that? Cause I know it probably causes some tension, doesn't it?
I mean, it felt very suffocating.
Mm-hmm.
I remember, and I'm noticing now that I'm older, I realize that I will physiologically respond to an environment that is not healthy for me.
Mm-hmm.
And so there were times where I thought that I was depressed and I was having panic attacks and things of that nature. And I realized that it wasn't me. It was that I was not, that space wasn't, I like, I could, I, I just couldn't breathe. I couldn't shake it. It was like just a weight that just felt like it was dragging me down and I could not I felt that I could not freely be myself.
Mm-hmm. I think what you just said there is my whole idea of even on this channel. When you think about when I remember when we left, the feeling that I felt was like I wasn't in bondage anymore. Like I could just be like, huh, like,
It felt, yeah,
even though,
very
you're
relieving.
just like, okay, it puts you in a very awkward space because you're so used to, like you mentioned, you've been there 15, 16 years
Mhm.
being in an organization and being in a church for that long of a time. I'm sure you just developed all these different, over the time, like you just get into a groove of this is what we do in the church and this is how it happens in the church. And so when you leave, you're just like, man, this weight is just taken off you. And even with spiritual abuse. And that's one of the things I'm learning too, as I'm studying this, is that a lot of times those systems will put so much performance and weight on the members that it becomes a point where it's just unbearable. It just becomes to the point where you're just like, I can't function like this spiritually anymore because I feel like I'm in this box.
Mhm.
Okay. And so when you started experiencing that, where were we at that point in our marriage? Is this when we kind of came back, or what was this while we were gone in North Carolina?
It was when we came back
When we came
because
back.
because again, in North Carolina, and I keep going back to this, but whenever I have my own space to freely create, freely do, freely take risks, freely work and do just anything that any type of space where I feel like I have the freedom to move, I am perfectly fine. And it's like, so it was when we got back and we were full-time ministry that it started to, like, the constriction, like, I could feel it setting in because you're there Sunday morning, you're there Sunday night, then you're there for then you might have Monday off, but there's Tuesday drama practice and Wednesday service, and then Thursday band practice and Friday Bible study, then Saturday outreach and Saturday concert, and so
It's nonstop.
it's
Yeah, it's
nonstop.
nonstop. Your whole life revolves around it.
Exactly, and it's now your friends are at the church because where are you going? Like before, as a teenager, I had my friends in school, I had my big sisters, I had
College.
work, people who we met at work, college, all that kind of stuff. But when we got back to do ministry full time, all your friends are there at church. Your vacations are Bible conferences.
Yeah,
Your
exactly.
entertainment is Saturday Night Live. Like
Oh gosh, yeah.
everything, everything was there, and it
Memorial Day
was
picnics, 4th of July
everything,
picnics.
everything
Yeah,
revolved around that space, and I could not take that. I was not healthy at all, and
yeah.
I felt myself, like, suffocating extremely quickly, and I thought it was me being pregnant and emotional or all kinds of things that they'll usually use to be an excuse and just kinda sweep it under the rug, but it was not a healthy space to be all consumed with that, so
hmm And then I can imagine, how do you think that I can imagine for you with your personality, once you hit that moment when you started feeling that restriction and feeling that kind of somebody putting you in that box, how do you think your personality responded to it? Do you just, because with you wanted to be free and just like, how do you think your personality just,
well, I couldn't understand, I was doing what I had always done. I was being who I had always been, but suddenly it was a problem.
hmm, okay,
Now all of a sudden it's a problem. And I'm like, this is the same, I'm the same woman.
yeah, mm,
Why is it a problem now? Now there's a paycheck involved,
okay,
right? Now there is, and that's what I was mentioning earlier about the difference between being single and married, because as we mentioned, it being the type of environment where it caters to men and the ego and discipleship and all that kind of stuff. Now, there was a point where the minister had upon some like I don't want to say upon because I don't want to be disrespectful, but if it makes sense, like he has something to hold on to and to manipulate because of how they have treatment, and that was being my husband. That was you.
yeah,
You know what I mean? So now that approach wouldn't have happened to me so much as a single
woman,
as a
yeah,
single woman,
yeah,
right?
yeah,
But because if you remember in our marriage, every issue would come through you.
Yeah, yeah,
No,
yeah,
I was never ever approached to say, "Hey," you know. So,
yeah.
uh,
And then even if you were approached, it was in a very, like you mentioned before, it was passive aggressive. It wasn't the direct issue dealt with. And that's the problem. So what that's called that you're talking about there is called, and I've studied this, is called triangulation.
mhm,
So what will happen is that in a situation where you have somebody that's trying to control or trying to manipulate your behavior, instead of going to you directly, they're going to go to the person that's closest
closest to.
connected to you
Mhm.
because they know how much you influence that person. So in our situation, what ended up happening with us was that if there was something that you were doing that wasn't an approved kind of like behavior, it would be brought to my attention in the hopes that I would then come to you and say, hey,
Yeah,
you need to fix this.
yeah.
You know what I mean? So,
And to clarify, like, to give an example of what was like a unapproved
yeah, let's get it.
behavior was having a homeschool group.
Yeah.
Like, I started a homeschool group with a couple of moms that had kids. We all had kids the same age, and so I was like, "This would be great. Let's meet Tuesdays and Thursdays. We could meet at my house. I could do little activities with the kids, and then on Thursdays, we can go and do fun stuff together." And that was not approved. That was an issue, so it would be simple things, and on top of that, non-biblical things.
So that is, I think you bring up a really good point because that's the one thing that I always want to go back to is biblical, is your behavior and how you're being treated and how people in the organization or in leadership are
Mhm.
responding to you just because of gender. Is that biblical? And I think that's where a lot of the issue comes in. But even the fact is, okay, you may say and ask that question, is that biblical? But my question then is when you're in it, how come nobody ever really says, hey, is this really biblical that I
Because
feel like
from
that?
because the culture teaches that your pastor is biblical. Your pastor is your headship.
Hmm.
He's your head, he's your leader, and so you are supposed to submit to headship,
Hmm.
right? That is a fundamental teaching that they give you. And so it's like, well, your pastor can be wrong and pastors make mistakes.
Yeah, because they're
And,
human.
because they're human, and when it comes to non-biblical matters, when it comes to things that aren't that gonna say you're not trying to murder your neighbor or something like that, then why can't it be debatable?
Yeah.
It's almost as if to, um, yeah, yeah, I'm gonna stop there.
Why not? You can be as open as you want to do about it. I think that having these conversations is important because it really brings to light what happens and what can happen in those environments. And I know that there's a lot of times where people are thinking these same thoughts while they're there,
Mm,
but because nobody talks about it, because in
right.
a lot of times those environments have this no talk
Mhm.
rule, like this kind of code of silence rule where
Yeah.
you can't
Then
say
you're labeled
anything, then
rebellious
you're labeled
or,
rebellious. Or I mean, do
difficult
you think
and
anybody? I know some of the interviews that I've had, some of the ladies have brought up being called a Jezebel. Do
oh,
you
yeah.
think that you've been labeled a Jezebel
Oh,
before?
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, it's just a scapegoat, um, you know, dog whistle, that they use in the church whenever a woman has the audacity to challenge even the smallest of even the simplest of things.
Mhm.
You know what I mean? Like, why would I be labeled a Jezebel to challenge you about what goes on in my own house?
Yeah.
Like, why are you telling me what I should be doing in my own house? You know what I mean? Like,
Right.
why is it in your, but it kind of goes to show like how much control, like little by little, these ministries start to get, these people start to depend on. Yeah, I just felt like when the shoe hit the fan, I just felt like that the chapter was over. I'm like, this chapter is done. I'm over it.
Mm.
You know what I
Uh,
mean? Like I know that there's bigger and I know that there's more. And I felt like I had that God did bring me there for a reason, for a season. And that season was over.
and that's it, and you're done.
And that was it.
I think but your response to it, I think, comes from your self-confidence because you like you said and you mentioned earlier in, the beginning of us talking, you were already used to getting involved and you were already in a position or in a mindset rather that you didn't need to have validation from like a certain group, or you didn't need to have validation from this group of people in order to make you feel
Mhm.
self-confident or
Right.
you have your self-worth. And I think that's what helped to develop that mindset. Okay, well, the season's done and we're just
I'm
gonna
out.
move on. Yeah, exactly.
I'm out.
And I can imagine when that time did, happen where for you to move on, that if you felt suffocated, you were just like, "Phew, this is great. Like I can breathe now. I can actually live." How do you feel like the transition was from when you finally left and departed from that? What was your initial feelings through that time?
Peace.
Peace? Wow.
Peace and relief.
Mhm,
It was very relieving.
mhm,
Yeah,
mhm,
and that's kind of a shame, you know, but yeah, it was time. It was just time.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I think we definitely had a different response to it. I took more of the response like, "What in the world happened here?" And then because how my mind operates, I wanted to figure out like what happened. Like I wanted to know like how did I not see this coming? Or I even though I may have seen it coming before, but why did I not pay attention? Like what was in it in me that caused me to just continue to move along with it?
I think that kind of speaks volumes to the spiritual experience between men and women, because if you think about our stories separately, you came into the church and you were lifted up.
Yeah.
You were elevated, you were validated, you were given position, you were given, right? And so there's this, you were given value for being you.
Mhm.
But when I came to the church and I was being me, I was devalued. I was diminished. I was told, sit down and be quiet and let someone else do, or wait until I give you permission to act or to do or to say or to be. My value that I naturally had coming into that place was put down.
Mhm.
And so I was ready to get out of there.
Right. Right.
And I feel like that's the reason why our experience was completely different.
Yeah.
It was because it was so catered to the male ego. That's something I would imagine is hard for you to let go,
Yeah. It's
because
like a
it
crushing. You're like, the
because,
whole
you
identity
know,
is yeah.
right, and so because it's, you know, Jezebel and you're, you know, that kind of thing, it's soul crushing to where you can't just simply be you, so I was like, "Get me up out of here.
All right.
I'm not here for this." So,
Yeah. Yeah. I can see that. I can see that definitely. I could definitely. Do you feel like when you left that you had to learn how to build yourself back up in a sense? Like because like I said, like you mentioned, you felt devalued because of who you are. And then when you left, did you feel like you had to try and rebuild that within your own self?
um, I don't know if it's really having to, because my perception of myself, yeah, there were times where I felt devalued. So I think coming out of that, just looking at the world, looking at myself through just a clear mind and a clear lens. Like, this isn't what somebody else says. This is specifically how God views you, how you operate, how you move, and just falling back in love with that and receiving that. But it was hard. It was hard too.
Mm, mm.
Um,
Man, I'm sorry you had to go through that. I can, like I said before, and we've been talking before. When I listen to some of the stories, and you listen to some of the experiences and the perspective. For me now, as a man hearing that story, I'm like, man, I wouldn't want anybody to like try and push me down or hold me down. Then having a daughter now, like I would, as a father, and as knowing how protective I am of the kids, I would think to myself, like, if anybody ever did that, like, me and them are gonna have a problem. You're not gonna devalue my little girl. You're not gonna do this to my
right.
princess.
But it's very subtle.
Yeah.
That's the thing about a lot of abusive environments is that it's subtle. There's a love bombing in the very beginning,
Hmm.
and then they get you acclimated to the culture. And it's like we said, you don't want to be labeled the rebel, so you don't question things. And any institution or any place that forbids questioning is automatically abusive in my book. That is one lesson that I learned from the jump. If
Yeah.
you have a parent, when you have parents that are like, don't question me, right? No, that's abusive because our kids ask a why. And if I love them, I
I
just
mean,
explain
explain
it
it.
to
Yeah.
them. And if they want to discuss, then we discuss. And we can go back and forth and say, well, can I have another popsicle? I don't have to intimidate them and force them in a particular direction. If I feel like I have to do that, then that's abusive. And jobs in the capital world don't question whose salary. There's always that question like salary, right?
Mhm.
Well, a lot of people speculate the reason why they don't want us to ask questions is because you're going to find out that they're paying someone completely different from you with
Yeah.
different job skills or for whatever reason. So they're like, hush, hush, no questions.
Right. No questions allowed.
Anytime people don't want you to ask questions, beware.
Yeah.
And so,
That's the lesson I learned coming out of this is I'm gonna ask you some questions. If you don't
absolutely.
want to answer the questions, then you got to be like, okay, red flag, because there's something that you're not telling me here. There's something that I'm missing here
Hmm.
that shouldn't be there. And then, so going back to what you were saying about being in that space where you felt like you had to build your own value, what would you say to someone who may be coming out of a situation like this? And what I've learned, even in having these conversations, like, I know that this channel is about spiritual abuse. I know that it's talking about the things that can happen in the church from church hurt. But the thing I've also been learning is that these things that we're discussing really is abuse in general, like
Yeah.
physical abuse,
Yeah.
domestic abuse,
Yeah.
anything. If somebody, you're out here listening to this and you're like, oh, maybe I didn't experience spiritual abuse. Yeah, you may not have experienced it in the church, but it could be in some other different arena. But I think a lot of the concepts are the same.
Yep.
So, with that being said, my next question would be, what would advice or what encouragement would you give someone that may be coming out of an abusive relationship as a woman? How would you encourage them on how to build back up their value
Mm.
as a woman?
I would encourage them to reach back into that inner child, like who you really are, and start doing that again. I just wrote a song. I just wrote a song. I think I decided what to call it, Through It All,
Okay,
right?
through it all.
But
Maybe we'll put a link in the description
maybe.
if it's ready. Link in the description. Okay.
But yeah, I just wrote a song called Through It All. And the story is about a woman who is cleaning house. And it's a huge metaphor, but it's a metaphor for digging inside yourself and looking at the dark, ugly places, but finally starting to realize who you really are. So in the beginning, the locks on the door are very hard to open,
Mhm.
right? Her heart is very hard to open. She's very hard to trust other people. And so she finally gets inside of herself and she sees memories. These things break her down. She sees holes in the walls. She sees broken pictures and all these different things. And one of the lines says, the holes in the walls, the framed broken pictures, and that small broken child will always stay with her. And so there's your inner child, your true self is still there.
Right.
But a lot of times it's suppressed by the systems that we grow up in. And so there are things that we genuinely loved to do. And when you find yourself getting out of touch with that, you'll find that happening in those abusive relationships. So my suggestion is to dig deep and figure out what that was, what it was that made you feel alive and that you truly enjoy doing, and just dive in and do it. Find community, find conferences about sewing if it was sewing or drawing, or watch YouTube videos of cooking if that was something that you love to do. Just finding that piece of you that no one can take away, no one can judge, that it is me and myself, my me and myself moment
Hmm. Yeah.
that you simply dive back into and you just enjoy it like a kid in a candy store. You know what I mean? And let that be like a foundational building block to building yourself back up as a person, because for me, it was always songwriting. So I knew exactly what I was gonna do. I'm like,
Yeah,
I
yeah,
could just be locked in this room and just write songs all the time
yeah,
and get it all out, you know?
yeah, yeah. I think that's important.
Yeah.
I think that's some good advice. I think also too what I hear you saying a little bit, and I don't know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong on it. Getting back to that part of you that, like you said, looking inside of you. If you think about it, that's for a lot of us. That's like our place of safety.
Mhm.
Like it's a place where, when you get back to that moment where you're not worried about being judged, you're not worried about being looked at, you're not worried about an eye on you all the time, you're not worried about any of that. You're just saying, hey, this is who I am, and I'm safe in this place and in this space.
Yeah.
And I think that's where I think you're absolutely right. I think that's where a lot of our healing does really start, is us just getting back to that safety. I know for me, that's where I just know over the last years just really worked through. We've had conversations, just learning and remembering things about my past and seeing now like how those things affect me, and then really just tapping into, okay, I need to figure out how to get back to that safe space. And I think too also that safe space really is another place where you can really reconnect with God, and
Absolutely.
then learn how to reconnect with God in a real way,
As opposed to
doing,
yeah.
you know.
Yeah. And because the last line of the song goes, she goes up to the attic because, initially she goes down to the basement. And that's that's your lower self, that's your lowest self. But at the end of the song, she goes up to the attic, and to her surprise, all her hopes and her dreams have survived
Mhm.
all this time.
Did you have a dream about that? Wasn't some of that based on a dream you had?
Not based on a particular dream,
Or
just
parts
based on like series of dreams.
Yeah.
Because a lot of times when you have dreams and you have dreams of parts of a house,
Yeah, it's your
they meet,
subconscious.
yeah, it's your
Yeah,
subconscious, yeah,
yeah.
and all that kind of stuff. The attic is the highest part of the house. It's your higher self. It's
Mhm.
connecting back to God and your true self.
That's good.
Yeah.
I think that's good. I wanna wind it down, land it on that because I think it lands on a really good note of encouragement.
Hmm.
Getting back to that who you are, getting back to that place of safety is a really good point to start learning how to heal from it. So I think it's a good place to
And I
begin to
think
land.
I think it's for going back to Women's History Month. As women, we are socially conditioned to conform for everyone else before ourselves.
Mhm. Mhm.
The hair, the nails, the makeup. Why do we do that?
Yeah.
A lot of time, initially, the onslaught of that was for physically attractive for someone. You know what I mean? And a lot of people who have confidence to just do it just because they love to do it. They're out there and that's great. But overall, in general, that is the purpose of that. And that's one simple social construct that says that we must conform for the sake of others' perspective of us. And then we're always trained subconsciously to be ready to get married and be ready to have kids and things of that nature. And all that's well and good, but no one ever reassures you of just being you and that just being enough.
Mhm. And put all those extra layers on and
Yeah.
wear all that stuff. I agree. So how do you think that let's look at the context of the church. How do you think coming out of the church, being in ministry, seeing that, what ways do you think that we as a church, and kind of when I say church, I'm talking about like the body, like the people. If I'm a Christian, you're a Christian, like we are the church. But how do you think that we can help to change the culture around that and how women are treated and how they're valued? What advice can you, from a woman's perspective, say, hey, church, this is how women feel. This is what we can do to change the culture or even start and begin to change the culture. What do you think needs to be some of the first steps?
For the church to change the culture?
Yeah.
Let women lead and let them make mistakes without assuming those mistakes are because they're women. You
Right.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, um, I don't know. I think I think that the church has to pay close attention to abusive characters in general.
Mm,
Like we talked about earlier, we're talking about spiritual abuse, but it's really abuse, and you could apply these things to anywhere across the board. And the problem is that if you have someone who is abusive, whether it be, let's say, for example, domestically, they should not find comfort. They should not be comfortable in your church. If people are abusive in other areas, if they're an abusive boss or they're an abusive parent, they shouldn't, if they find comfort coming to church and they find justification for their behavior in your church, that's a problem to begin
yeah.
with. So the church really needs to pay close attention and understand the culture of abuse and make sure that it's not woven into the fabrics of its culture
Mm.
too.
I think that starts with educating. A lot of times people don't know what to look for.
Yeah.
You
They
know?
don't yeah.
Yeah.
They don't recognize it. And I feel like that's the reason why it's very easy to get young impressionable people into the church to begin with, because nobody recognizes those things.
Mm.
Yeah, education, talking about it. Women can't be afraid to talk about it.
And that's why I appreciate you coming on and just sharing that.
I
I know it's
appreciate you having me.
there we go.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think it's
Yeah.
good to have those conversations.
Yeah. And of course, men being willing to listen.
Yeah, that's we've talked about that.
Yeah.
You need to learn how to listen. Yeah, we're working on it. Let's open our ears and actually hear. So
Yeah.
that's good. Anything else you can think of to add? No.
Any other questions?
No, that's about it. I think we can land it here. I'm really encouraged about what we talked about. I love just hearing your perspective on it. And I just mentioned too a little bit, it took me a long time to process and figure out what happened to it. And I know, just to let you know, if I've never said it, I know over the years, as I was trying to figure that out in my own head, what really kept me afloat was your response to it. Just the upbeat, okay, well, yeah, that's their loss. Let's move on. In my mind, I was like, oh, my whole ego is crushed and I'm shattered. But for you, you were just like, well, they done missed out on good talent. Like they missed out on something good that God wanted to maybe use or do in that environment, and they missed out on it. And so that helped me out tremendously, definitely during those tough times. So I want to appreciate you for just your perspective on it, how you've seen it, and how you've handled it. I think you've handled it extremely well. I'm proud of you. You're crushing it with the music right now. At the moment that we're recording this, you just won Song of the Year at the Veer Music Awards just a couple weeks ago. You got a new EP out. I mean, things are happening, and I think it's a prime example of what you were talking about in our conversation. You felt suppressed, and as soon as that like restriction was released, it's like, okay, I'm free. I'm just
Yeah.
gonna fly all over the place.
Yeah.
And so I'm proud of you. I guess as we're leaving, where can people find you? I know, like I mentioned, you got your music, you got a lot of things going on. Where can people find you online?
I am RobertaLea.com.
There you go.
Spelled Lea.
LEA, not with an E.
Spell it with an E.
It ain't me. There we go. We gotta. Somebody said we gotta make a shirt about that. I heard something.
Me and my friend Tyler. He
Okay.
knows. Yeah.
So yeah, I'll put a link down in the description below to where you can find what Roberta's working on, her music that she's working on, all the different projects she's working on. I'm extremely proud of her. I'm just ecstatic about how things are going, how doors that are opening up, opportunities that are opening up, and just seeing the healing and seeing the progress and just seeing the growth over the years has been amazing as your husband. So I'm proud of you. Definitely proud of you. So we're going to go ahead and land it here. I'm so encouraged. If you found some value out of this conversation, let us know down in the comments. I'd love to hear your feedback. What are the observations that you may have seen in the church when it comes to women and how they're treated? And what are some ways that you think that we can just change that in our culture and especially in the church? Let me know down in the comments below.